All right. I want to take a moment and just really from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys for being here. I think tonight is a very important night. Obviously, as a school, we're getting trained. I think you're the most important person in your child's life. And I think it's good that you're going to hear from Dr. Schoenfeld about things to look for, conversations to have, a lot of great information. I've appreciated all the support I've been given. I do know this 100% is a marathon. This is a long-term commitment. And this is definitely not a time for applause, but I'd be remiss not to extend my deepest appreciation just to our superintendent, who's been absolutely phenomenal. I know she was coming tonight. I don't know if Vicky's in. Oh, there's Vicky right here. Vicky has just anything we need at Saugus High School, we're getting. Anything that we're asking for, levels of support, she's providing for us. And it's just been an absolute rock for me so I can focus on the kids. And just want to thank you very much, Vicki and Mike Coleman, our next superintendent. So I really appreciate both of you guys very much. With that said, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Beatty, who's going to do the official introductions.
Good evening. Dr. Nikolas Beatty, Director of Counseling for the William S. Hart School District. Very quickly after Thursday happened, I came to the conclusion that we need to benefit from the unique educational experience and unique expertise of a national leader in this area. And so after speaking to a number of colleagues, they all pointed to Dr. David Schoenfeld. So him and I together and the district are going to create a sustainable long-term plan for recovery. His information and material is vital. So I'm not going to take any more time. Dr. Schoenfeld.
All right. Well, good evening, and thank you so much for coming out. And I know that this is a difficult time to be separated from those you care about, even to come and talk about a topic such as this. So I'm just going to ask, how many of you are parents of current children at this high school? Okay, I see a predominant response. That's good. And how many of you are children of parents who attend another school in the system? So a couple of you, okay. And how many of you are mental health providers out in the community, or Department of Mental Health? Okay, and you guys can also sit down. If you'd like. So they're standing near the door so they can get away, but that's fine. So my training is as a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and I direct the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement that's located at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And in the interest of making sure that I'm here to answer your questions and deal with your issues, I'm not going to tell you any more about the center, other than to say that we've responded to crisis events. I can tell you personally, I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and we've responded to a lot of the major crisis events, both around violence as well as natural disasters throughout the United States and abroad. And you probably have never heard of the center because we try and do the work behind the scenes to empower the local communities to be able to have a sustainable long-term response, and so people don't know we're there. And we're working on that a little bit because it's kind of hard to find us, because most people don't know we exist until they call another school that's dealt with a crisis event. So actually, if we can make sure that, if we can project the slides now, that'll be great. What I want to do is I want to make sure I have enough time for questions. So I will take questions as I'm presenting. It's just you may have to shout because it's a kind of a big auditorium, and it's a little hard for me to kind of scan all the audience and know who's raising their hand. So if you see someone raising their hand, you can scream at me. You can scream at me anyway, but that would be a good reason. In addition, I think their plan is to stream some of the presentation for others and to tape it. So what we will do is if you have a question that you don't want to be in the public domain, then let's ask that question at the end and we'll stop the taping and streaming so that you feel a little bit more comfortable. So first off, as soon as we get this to go, there are a couple things that I just wanted to go over because to provide some basic information. One is, how do you provide support after a crisis event to children? And I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to be honest, that most of what I say applies to adults equally. I was recently talking to a group at a course, and they told me most of the people there were actually represented corporations and companies, and they weren't schools and they weren't children. So what I told them is that in pediatrics, we always say children aren't just little adults, but I will tell you after crisis, adults act like big children. So everything I say will apply if you're also concerned about, an adult family member. It's the same type of issues. And the advice that I give is not going to be specific to shooting events. It's related to when children are in crisis. And that could be for an individual or family crisis. So it doesn't have to be after a mass shooting. A lot of the strategies are still the same. I'll go over some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that you may see, talk about the timeline for adjustment, although I will tell you, I can't tell you the amount of time. I can also only tell you the process, because it varies by the situation and it also varies by the child and the family. And then we'll turn a little bit to talking about supporting grieving students, because you actually have two different situations here that often co-occur. One is the trauma of being in an event where your life was at risk or you were afraid that your life was at risk. And the other is losing someone that you care about. And they are different in terms of the approaches and the strategies. And there's a tendency, I think, in our country that, and it's not just our country, but because we've talked about so much about being informed about trauma, people are not as informed about the other aspects. So I do want to at least spend some time talking about that. And if we don't have the ability to project, I can just keep going. So what I'll start with is to talk, and then once we get the slides working, I'll show you a brief video. It's about 2 minutes. And now we don't have a microphone. So I was with someone from the National Association of School Psychologists, who's actually pretty well known, and he was like with finger puppets. Like, I have never had that much admiration for another professional. It's sometimes, the ideogram for crisis is actually in Chinese is two pictures. The pictogram,
Testing
one
one,
is
testing
danger and one is opportunity. And that is actually how they portray crisis. And so in that particular case, that danger of not
Testing
having
one, testing
any audio-visual gave us the opportunity for
Testing
him
one,
to
testing
show
two.
his finger puppets in a way that I still remain impressed. Not that impressed that I want to keep talking about it. Can you hear me in the back? Oh, you can. Wow. Okay. I will just keep talking louder, and if you can't hear me, just do that, and either you're having trouble hearing. Symptoms, please don't wait for them. The other thing that I'm going to tell you is that these are symptoms of adjustment reactions. So they're not specific to a mental illness or specific to a major disaster or crisis.
Testing one, testing two.
So, like the first one is sleep problems.
Testing one, testing two.
I don't think there's anyone here who doesn't have a kid who's had a sleep problem at one point. Because I remember discussing this with a group of parents, and some came up and said, my kid has like 3. And I'm like, oh yeah, only 3. So please understand these are things to look for, but they're not always due to the event. So the same thing with sleep problems. Parents will come up to me and they'll say, I don't know if my teenager's having trouble sleeping because there was a shooting, or because they don't go to sleep on time, or because they're on social media, or because they're an adolescent, or because they're depressed from something else, or because they're anxious. And I look at them and I go, oh, sometimes we can be thankful for small things. Both things. That's incredible. Okay. So basically what I said to the parent was, you know what, you may not know, but if your child's having trouble sleeping, let's talk about getting them a good night's sleep. So please understand that a lot of what I go over is going to be what I would call non-specific. So I don't want you to start thinking that, oh my God, my kid's, got a mental illness because he, was tired one day. So sleep problems is the first on the list because sometimes that's the one that is the biggest problem. And I actually see that a lot. So it can be trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, frequent wakening, nightmares, difficulty waking up. Any disruption in sleep really disrupts performance at your job or at school the following day and sometime afterwards. And so we talk about getting symptomatic improvement around sleep as being important. So I mentioned I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician, but I've never written a prescription for medication for sleep for someone as a result of crisis or loss. So I'm not suggesting that you go to a doctor and start prescribing medication. But what I am saying is you want to make sure that there's attention to what we call sleep hygiene, consistent bedtimes. Teenagers often don't have consistent bedtimes, and they get away with it. They stay up. I remember this when I was a teenager. I got along quite well with my parents, but it really was nicer when they were asleep and we were up. And then they get up and I'm asleep. And so on the weekends, we had a little bit of time shift. I'd stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning, sleep till noon, and that worked well. And then I'd get back into sync for the school week. The problem is when you're having disrupted sleep or you're under stress, you're not as flexible in adjusting your sleep schedule. So you probably want to tell kids, you need to get a good night's sleep. If you're having trouble sleeping, let's just go to bed at the same time each night. Let's try and keep to the schedule. You want to make sure that you start to prepare for sleep prior to. So it may be that you stop watching your phone and the computer and video screens for a period of time before you go to sleep, that you do some things that normally are calming for you, whether it's that you shower or bathe, take a bath beforehand. For some people, that just makes them too hot and they don't sleep as well. So you ask them what's calming for you. Maybe that they read a book, but obviously you have to make sure it's a book that's calming. You also want to make sure that the temperature is correct, that the bedding is appropriate, that the lighting is appropriate. If they can't sleep because they can hear you watching TV after they've gone to sleep, then I would suggest you turn off the TV. And so, you want to set up an environment that's most conducive for sleep. That's the start. Then there are certain learned sleep associations and rituals that people have, and you want them to continue those. Some people like certain bedding, they like weighted blankets, so you make sure that you're doing that as well. And then, if that's not sufficient, you can start working on strategies for relaxation that make sleep more conducive. So that might be techniques in progressive relaxation, mindfulness, guided imagery. And those are skills and techniques that mental health staff as well as medical staff can help kids learn. So when I say get help with sleep, it's not to write a prescription. It's to try and work on adequate sleep. You may find kids will have separation anxiety and school avoidance, so they may be hesitant to come back to school if there's been a shooting at school, but they may be hesitant to go to school if there's been a trauma at home. It's the separation from those that they care about, that they may worry about their family members if they're not somehow there to protect them, or worry about themselves if their parents aren't there to guard them. The issue is that parents often feel the same way, and they inadvertently convey that to kids. So I was talking to a kid who was a parent, actually, of a child who was in a school shooting, and I mentioned that, and the mother looked at me and she said, okay, I'm going to be honest, the one day I took him to school, I sat in the parking lot and I cried in my car. I couldn't leave the parking lot. And I go, and I'm guessing he picked up on that. So the issue is, if your child is hesitant and you're hesitant, it's very understandable. But you need to work with mental health staff in the school to start a program and initiative to get them back into a school-like setting as quickly as possible with accommodations. Maybe the first couple of days they only go to the nurse's office. It may be that they're not going to walk into the quad, and you have to figure out how to get them in through a back entrance. You work with the staff to try and adapt, make the adaptations and the accommodations that make that transition tolerable. I remember talking to one family. Their child had been shot, and the child's sibling had been killed. And so he did not want to go back to school, as you would expect. And the mother said, "What do I do? He's talking about just finishing high school online. What do you think about that?" And I said, "What I think about that is that it will be hard to go away to college after completing high school online. And then it's hard to get a job after completing college online. So if the goal is ultimately independence and work outside of the home, you really should start that transition now." And the parent looked at me and said, "That is why we're encouraging him to keep going." And he was. He was having a lot of adjustment difficulties, but he was like, "I'm going back to the school. That's where I belong. That's where my friends are. I'll deal with the panic attacks. I'll get the counseling." And so the issue is, if it's hard, it's hard. But I really think that the goal should be and the expectation of getting into a school-like setting. Now, I say school-like setting because it may not be the same school, or it may not be the same classroom, depending on the incident and their particular fears and worries. In most situations, though, kids do want to stay in the same school because that's where all their friends are. It'd be one thing if all of their friends would transfer with them, but that generally doesn't really work. So most of the time, it actually is the same school, but doesn't have to be. Kids may also be fearful, as you would imagine, so they may have trauma-related fears. So if there's been a shooting that's occurred in the school, they might be afraid of loud noises. We've provided guidance on what to do on the 4th of July for kids who have been in the school shooting, with some practical advice of if you're going to go to fireworks, how do you go there, who accompanies you, even practical suggestions like the first time you go, maybe you go with your parents instead of your friends if you're going to be embarrassed, if you're upset in front of your friends. And maybe you sit on the outskirts of where the fireworks are with ready transportation to leave so that you can leave if you decide it's no longer enjoyable for you. So, I can go into, you can anticipate some of the trauma-specific fears and try and adapt to them. But what most people don't realize as much is that it can become fearful. So they may become anxious. And that's kind of a non-specific fear. So they may become afraid of the dark, even if the incident happened in daylight. And that makes them feel like they're going crazy, or they're disturbed. So to explain to them that it's fearfulness, and the fearfulness may be specific to the event, but it may also be more generalized. And feeling scared is part of what happens when you've been through a traumatic event. And as I said, as I go through these are common reactions. And it is not they're not really symptoms in the sense that they don't necessarily indicate any mental illness. So people who have been in shootings are likely to have these type of reactions for a period of time. You can have difficulties with concentration, and that leads to academic difficulties. Kids do not learn at the same rate. They have trouble learning new information, retaining that information, applying concepts in other contexts, and showing and demonstrating their knowledge in tests. So that is a variable, and sometimes it's quite significant. I remember one school shooting where the teachers estimated about 3 years loss in academics, at least for a time period. And this was with young children, but it is generally temporary. And so how many of you have children who are juniors or seniors? That is one of the more difficult time periods because, to be quite honest, at baseline in a high-achieving school, the kids are already learning at least their capacity, and they're pushing themselves just to keep up. If they have anything that pulls them down, it starts to feel like it's going to ruin their lives. And it feels overwhelming, but you do need... I went to one school, very high-achieving, very large school crisis event, and they were closed for multiple weeks. And I met one of the teachers, and she said, I teach AP, and I've only got 5 weeks left to the school year, and I've already lost 3. How am I going to catch up? And I looked at her, and I just said, "You won't." And she goes, "What do you mean?" And I go, "The kids were learning as quickly as they could before. They can't learn at twice their pace when they're also struggling. It's just not going to happen. And you shouldn't have that expectation." And I remember the teacher looked at me and she goes, well, then they won't get AP credit. And I go, yeah, they won't get AP credit. You know, in the grand scheme of things, I'm not trying to minimize it, but, you know, I remember one of my kids was in college, and somehow I saw her transcript. She wasn't hiding it from me. She showed it to me, and I go, why does it say you're in the second semester of your junior year when you've only been in college for 3 months? And she's like, oh, it's all the AP credit. And I'm like, oh, does that mean? And she just stopped me and she goes, Dad, you're paying for all 4 years. Don't even think it. And I go, but just theoretically, could one graduate in a year and a half? And she was like, it's not happening. We're not even having the conversation. It's going to be at least 4 years. So the issue is, I don't really know what all of those AP credits did. And there's a certain amount that we want kids to thrive. And, you know, we have to set reasonable expectations for them. Sometimes you just have to back those down a little bit for a period of time. We have worked with schools to help draft letters to go out with college applications for juniors to kind of explain the temporary impact on standardized testing and grades so that they understand that these are short-lived phenomenon and that the school is responding, and we anticipate and expect the children to return to their baseline rate of learning, but to have gained the insight and empathy and skills by having dealt with this crisis event, and so they will be better students when they get to your campus, and this is how you can judge their transcript more accurately in light of the trauma. We usually add in a little paragraph like, our whole country has stood behind us as we deal with yet another national tragedy. God bless America, please take our children. So you just have to expect that that's going to happen. And what we don't want is for the kids to have the added burden of thinking they're going to fail at school and to be afraid to come to school, not just because of what happened, but because they think they are going to fail. So we have to make sure that we set reasonable expectations. And, you know, I'm happy to take some questions about what do you do when you don't know? Could they really do this if they tried harder? And how much are they trying? And how much are we pushing them too far? Those are all questions that you work with your college counselor and the mental health staff in the school to help try and sort out. There isn't an easy answer, but most kids try and want to do as well as possible. So if they're telling you it's too hard, in most cases it's too hard for them, and we need to make those adaptations. And so I've been talking with some of the teaching staff about different academic accommodations that can be made and different adjustments and how you actually realign your expectations with their abilities for wherever they're at the time. You also see some regression, and I know that most people think of what we call developmental regression. Kids who were 5 years old and they were doing fine, and now they wet their bed or they become a little more clingy. What you will also see, though, is social regression. So kids who have been in crisis situations will often act immaturely. They may become more self-centered, less focused on the needs of others, because people have to take care of themselves when they're in crisis before they can attend to the needs of others. So they may seem selfish, but they can be irritable, cranky, intolerant of change, inflexible. You know what your kids are like and what you are like when you're stressed out. Well, that they can do that too. And that regression is not just children. So I went to one community, they had they had a large disaster that resulted in a fair amount of loss of life and property. And I was talking with the parents before we got started for a session such as this, and I asked one of the mothers, how old are your kids? And she just looked at me and said, well, I have a number of kids. I'm really worried most about 2 of them. One is 5 and one is 35, and I'm more worried about the 35-year-old. And her husband was right there. He started crying and he left the room. And the issue is it's not just the children. You may see this among yourself, you may see it among your spouse, you may see it among your child's teacher, you may see it among administrators, community leaders. It affects a lot of people. And I think what we really have to do is just be tolerant when people are stressed, cut them a little bit of slack, and then recognize that you're probably not at your best either. And I've already heard staff, I'm very impressed with the people that I met with here today because they've been open and candid and really looking to try and figure out how best to do this. And, I've had school staff who have said, I am not as tolerant as I am normally, and I get insulted when kids say things, and I take it personally, and it's not personal, and I know that. And I think that level of insight just a couple days after a shooting is unusual. So I'm very hopeful that the recovery process will go faster here, perhaps than in the absence of that type of openness. But please understand that there are going to be times when you're strained. And even for doing this work myself, there are times when I'm cranky. I was telling people, my wife always makes that as an excuse. So I don't like that. I'll come home, been away for a week, and I'll say, dear, did you take care of this? And she goes, oh no, I forgot. And I'm like, you always forget. I had hoped you would really do it. It was important. She'll go, I know, it must have been really stressful at that school, and I know you're just irritable because you've been under stress. And I'm like, no, actually, it was fine time. Had a nice dinner out, good people. I'm really okay. Yeah, that's what you say when you're really stressed. And I'm like, I'm really not. So I think the issue is we can't always assume we're stressed out, but we just have to keep thinking about, how did I just react? Why am I doing that? Is there a way I can? And sometimes you have to apologize to people and tell them, I realized I was a little curt with you the other day, but I really hope you can help me with this. You'll see sadness and depression, and so in kids, one of the things you look for is if they no longer take joy in the things that used to be enjoyable to them. So this can be tricky. I've seen students will say things like, so in New York City, we worked in New York City schools after 9/11, and there were a number of kids who were in a magnet school in finance that was in Wall Street, and they were like, I don't really want to go back there. And people were like, why? Are you scared? And they go, oh, no, I'm not scared. It's just, really, is making money that important? And you're like, seriously? And they really couldn't tell. Was it that they had now a new insight into priorities in life and money was no longer as important? Or was it that they were just scared? And then kids would say things like, I don't really want to go out to a party. And you go, why aren't you going out to a party with your best friends? And they go, they drink. I don't really want to drink. It's just they get drunk. It's sloppy, And the parents are like, oh, good, you don't want to do that anymore. But the issue is, I always say, if they're not doing the things they used to do that brought them into company with peers, ask them what they are doing now with their peers. So if they say, well, I'm volunteering at the synagogue, I'm volunteering at the church, I'm part of the Junior Peace Corps, I'm helping, I'm doing other things with kids that have the same type of priorities I now have, then I go, okay, that's good. We'll talk about post-traumatic growth. But if they're just staying home because they're scared to go out, then that actually isn't good. And sometimes you just have to remind your kids that they're kids, and they need to do kid things. And that means being with peers. Because I will tell you, if they don't socialize with peers, they don't learn the social skills the same way, and then they're not very good with adults when they're adults. And so you really have to kind of make kids be kids, even if they've been through a very adult-like experience. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And then you just have to deal with your stress related to that. I remember at one point my kids switched schools, we moved, it's a long story, and my daughter ended up in another school, and she said, look, and she was like a junior, and she said, Dad, I'm gonna go to this party tonight. This school has a lot of drinking. And so the party starts at 1 a.m, it's an after party from a dance at the school. I've got a designated driver, and I'm like, when you say designated driver, you're going with a 16-year-old. Like, how do you have a designated driver 5 years before they're supposed to drink? And she goes, because she won't be drinking at that party. And she said, Dad, you can't call the families. It's a small school. I will be embarrassed. I will be ostracized. Just know that there's a lot of drinking, and you will have to trust that I will be responsible. And I'm like, and I looked at her and I go, your designated driver is your best friend that you've known for 2 months but never gone to a party with. So how do you know she won't actually drink? And she's like, okay, valid point. And so I said, what about I pick you up? You go with your designated driver and I pick you up. And she says, okay, I can do that. And then I said, I'll park a block away. And she goes, Dan, I'm not embarrassed by you. You can just come and pick me up. So then I kind of said, I am a little uncomfortable that there's this much drinking. And she looked at me and she said, okay, Dad, at the school I was at before, it was much larger. There were a lot of people drinking there, but I didn't go with that clique. I didn't socialize with them. I have no other option here because of the size of the school. And then she just looked at me and she said, perhaps I made a mistake by shielding you from this information before. And maybe I should have gone to these parties before and it wouldn't be as stressful now. And I'm like, okay, just go. Just go and call me. So the issue is you kind of need to be letting kids go and be kids. You will also see substance use, so increase in alcohol, tobacco, and other substance use. So you need to be monitoring for that, and unfortunately, because of the nature of the substances that are now circulating in the general community, with some of them being very strong opioids cut with fentanyl and other things, that the substance use was always risky, but now the risk of overdose is even greater. So you want to be looking for that and getting help and assistance around it. Somatization is another reaction. A lot of people with physical symptoms actually have psychological distress, and they complain of headaches, stomach aches, fatigue, inability to sleep, and they may actually just be having psychological distress. The tricky thing is that stress hormones also cause a lot of those symptoms, and you can see increases in high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma attacks. So as an example of what we did, we've been working closely with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and Parkland community since the shooting there. So they opened a wellness center with about 15 staff on the high school property, and they included a nurse in the wellness center. They have a nurse in the clinic, but they wanted to co-locate a nurse where the mental health services were so that they could be able to provide a more comprehensive triage and support. So I don't know any other place that's done that, but when we talked with them about somatization, and we did training for all the school nurses and stuff, so this is another group that needs help, because I don't know about the school district, but school nurses often are pretty over committed in schools at baseline, and then once you have a crisis on top of it, it can be quite overwhelming. The next thing I wanted to talk about was guilt and anger. It seems to me that people find enormous abilities to feel guilty about things they're not responsible for. And some of that has to do with how we are raised. And I'm not just talking about cultural, some of it's just conceptual development. So very young children, they have what we call magical thinking, and they assume that their thoughts, wishes, and feelings cause events in the world, and we encourage that. So, we tell them if you pray for it to get, a war to end, it will end. And they don't quite understand that there's a difference between praying and trying to make it happen directly through their thoughts. And so they may feel responsible. And so I'm going to mention something. I'm making sure are there any children here? Because once I did this by mistake. Okay, so I'm Catholic, and I raised my kids to believe in Santa Claus. But let's be honest, it's pretty far-fetched. So if your kid is taught that if they clean their room on December 2nd, some dude in the North Pole is going to care enough to ask elves to make a toy of their liking and hold on to it and bring it by sled pulled by reindeer, I'm just going to say, spoiler alert here, that's pretty far-fetched. And if you actually believe that, if you believe that's the cause and effect relationship, then you may believe that if you yell at your mother and she develops breast cancer a week later and then dies, you killed her. And I will tell you, the latter is more logical. And so the issue is the magical thinking that we start with in childhood makes us feel powerful. That's why kids like it. That's why we encourage it. But sometimes power, when bad things happen, makes you feel guilty and responsible. So I've had kids who have had siblings die, and parents have told them all the information, all the medical knowledge about it. And then I talk alone with the kid and I ask, why did your brother die? And they look at me and go, I went to camp that day. Or it's something they did or said, and they don't tell other people that because you don't want to tell people you killed someone you love. So there are people who are going to feel, and we carry this forward into adulthood, and we fall back on it when we're under stress. I hear teachers all the time wondering what they did in first grade, second grade, that's responsible for someone's actions when they shot someone else when they were adults or when they were later teenagers. So everybody wonders what they did, didn't do, should have done, could have done that might have changed this outcome. And part of it is also, in addition to the magical thinking, is that if we feel responsible, it means we feel we have control. And at an unconscious level, it is often better to feel that you caused the death, because then you can convince yourself you have the illusion of control, which means you can prevent another tragedy. So if only I had asked my child every night before he went to sleep if he ever thought of hurting someone else, this would never have happened. But nobody wants to go to bed each night being asked that question. So the issue is that that illusion of control doesn't actually lead to adaptation, and it is an illusion, so it doesn't prevent these episodes from occurring in the future. And so, I've talked with family members like in Parkland, and they'll come up and say, I traveled from another country and came here because I thought my child would be the safest here and they would get the best education. And what have I done to my child? And the issue is, what you have done is worked as a parent to find a community that you thought would give them the safest location and best education. You didn't do anything wrong. It turned out not to occur that way, but it's not because of what you did. It's because of what someone else did when he came in and shot people. And so the issue is that guilt feeling may also, I should say, turn into anger, that somebody had to do something wrong. And what I see time and again is someone has to be fired. Because if you tell me that you're not doing anything substantially different, then what's going to prevent this from happening again? And I can't live with that. So you're going to either have to completely do things differently, or you're going to have to be fired. And we just see turnover of leaders and a lot of blame towards leaders. And thanks to social media, we don't actually have to worry about all of the things that prevented us from saying things that we would never say in front of people. And so these thoughts and wishes and feelings just get thrown out there, and they're really hurtful. And I've just seen in a lot of communities death threats, threats of violence, really cruel things being said. And I see that at so many levels. And what I try and convey to people is, you have every reason to be scared. You have every reason to be angry. Something like this should never happen. I'm not going to explain that it's okay. It is not okay. It's a horrible and senseless tragedy. And if you're not angry about it, I would wonder why. But that anger has to be moved into something that gives to positive change. And what I tell people is, look, the communities that heal fastest are when they come together, not when they split apart. And that when adults argue with each other, it's the children that get hurt. And I see this play out in communities where there's this questioning, this judgment, and there's a certain amount where we just have to figure out as adults how we talk about really important things, but with tolerance and with respect. And that is not easy to do. So if you remember one thing, Calvin calls for his mother and he says, a big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs. I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost my best friend. And his mother says, well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen. And he points out there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So just realize that the guilt is there. You're going to feel guilty. You're going to be angry. Other people are going to feel guilty. And all of that just makes it really hard for people to come together. So again, the communities and where the kids heal the best are the ones that figure out how to do that. And so I'm quite actually hopeful about this community, because I've seen less animosity, less anger, and that I think bodes quite well. But I don't know if I'm just here early. So please, as much as you realize when you're angry, you have every reason to be angry, but you have to make sure that anger moves in the direction of helping to create a better community for your child. A lot of people are going to talk about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Please recognize that this stress reactions that I showed you are extremely common, and so PTSD is not actually diagnosed until at least 1 month afterwards. The reason for that is the trauma symptoms are so common in the acute phase, they don't even call it a disorder. It's just a reaction. It doesn't mean we wait 30 days to provide support to someone who's having traumatic reactions. It just means it's acute stress and we provide the support acutely. But we don't even call it PTSD until a month has passed. And children have to have exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It's either as a victim, as a direct witness, or with children. It's if they've been informed about it to someone close to them. So with children, we've liberalized the diagnostic criteria. So a lot of kids are just going to be reacting to news of, say, a parent dying in a car accident out of state, and they will now be listed as having been exposed to traumatic experience. Problem that I have with this, and we can talk about this at some other point, is that bereavement looks a lot like the current diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and so it is easy to kind of overdiagnose. That does not mean that PTSD is not critically important. It just means that sometimes if we liberalize the diagnosis, we'll see a lot. Yeah.
Can you define child? What ages are you talking about? Under 18 or what are you talking?
Yeah, this question came up not that long ago, I think for a publication, and I tried to find it out, and I asked a lot of people. I don't know that it's defined, but I would say it's probably somewhere between 18 and 21. But I don't know that they have that particularly for this diagnostic criteria. I couldn't find it, and I went past Google. I mean, I was really serious. I called people who are child and adolescent psychiatrists and who do the licensing, the accreditation exam, and they're like, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Thank you, it's a good question. But I would imagine it's somewhere between 18 and 21, and I think there's not necessarily that much difference in terms of how an 18, 19, or 20-year-old would respond. So they have to have re-experiencing of the traumatic event, but that can be through recurrent, intrusive, distressing memories or dreams. And in children, they don't need to remember the content of the dreams. So they just said they had scary dreams. It is presumed after a traumatic event that that may be a post-traumatic reaction. The flashbacks, those dissociative reactions, are less common in children and not required. So it may be that they just have these intrusive thoughts and memories. They have avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma, so they don't want to think or talk about it, which is why they can be symptomatic, know they're symptomatic, and not tell you. Because in order to tell you, they have to think and talk about it. And so one of the core diagnostic criteria is it's hard to do that. In New York City schools, 6 months after 9/11, they surveyed over 8,000 kids, grades 4 through 12. About 1 out of 2 children reported they were actively trying not to think or talk about 9/11 6 months later. And that was when we started to talk in classrooms about what we were going to do at the 1-year mark. So you can just imagine how difficult that is because they are trying not to think about it, and you are trying to talk about it. So along those lines, if you sit down with your child and you say, please tell me, what are you thinking about? And they don't want to tell you, that is often a reaction, is not wanting to think or talk about it. So you just want to make sure that, first off, people will say, I mean, my kid looks fine, they're doing everything they're supposed to, they're succeeding in school, they have friends, but they're not really talking about it. And I go, well, if they're coping really well and thriving, they don't need to talk about it. I mean, and that's okay. But if they're not, or you're worried, then they should talk to someone. So then they go, well, I take them for counseling, but they won't talk to me. And I go, that's because you're not their counselor. And if they're talking to someone, that's okay. That's what you have to do, is you have to trust in your therapist, your counselor, the school mental health professional to be talking to your child. And if when they come home, they want to just spend time with their mom and dad and talk about, a basketball game or what happened, I'm going to say that's actually okay. Because if they're talking to someone and they're coping, that's really all that's expected. And maybe when they eat dinner, they actually want to talk about a basketball game. They don't want to have their therapy while they're over dinner. And so if you have concerns, talk to someone who talks to your child. It may be a mental health professional at school or in the community, maybe your pediatrician, it may be somebody that you trust in that has some of that skill set, who's related or is a friend. Make sure that someone's talking to the child, but they don't necessarily have to talk to you. It's actually okay if they talk to you about other things. I'm going to skip over the negative alterations in cognitions and mood because, quite honestly, it's very common. And that could be that they have a distorted sense of responsibility and feel guilty. And I already told you that just happens so much. And the last one is increased arousal, difficulty concentrating or sleeping, irritability or anger, self-destructive behavior, or a hypervigilance or exaggerated startle. Kids who are grieving have trouble concentrating and sleeping. You're just going to see a lot of this in grieving kids. And the reason I mention that is it's a wide range of reactions and concerns. It's not just trauma, symptoms, or disorders. It may be bereavement. So the problem with that is that we manage it differently. So I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, and a parent came to talk to the commission, and she said that at the end of the school year, she opened the yearbook up that her child brought back from Sandy Hook, and she said the picture of my child who was killed in Sandy Hook had been removed. And she said the picture of every child and staff that was killed that day was gone. And she said it's like they never existed. And she looked at the group and said, why would anyone do that? I've had conversations with people who make those decisions. They say an image of a child who has died is a trauma trigger, and we need to remove them. But how we commemorate, make meaning, and memorialize those we've lost is not the same process. And so we have to make sure that we don't view everything as trauma and that we understand that bereavement may be the issue. And I have actually talked to trauma specialists who have said things like, at least for the first several weeks, you don't need to ask about bereavement. Trauma trumps bereavement. And I would say it does not always. And we need to look for both and attend to both, and the management is, of course, quite different. There are also secondary losses and stressors occur, so it may be that, the coach who you really liked left because they weren't comfortable teaching there, or there were financial issues in the school because of drops in enrollment. There are all these other stressors that occur, and that's sometimes what the kids are really upset about. And so we can't assume it's all from an event. It can be from what follows. And to make it a little more complicated, one crisis often awakens feelings related to a pre-existing or a past crisis. And that's what comes to the surface. So I was talking to a group of teachers once after a student died. It was an elementary school student died accidentally by gunfire. A child found a gun and discharged it and killed this kid. And we were talking with the teachers about how to support kids around grief. And one of the teachers started sobbing, and we had to stop the workshop. And she then disclosed for the first time to her peers that she had miscarried. She had miscarried 20 years prior. It's just, when you talk about one crisis, you just think about everything that came from your childhood. I talked with one teacher after a school shooting. She came to meet with me privately, and she said, this was a young child, and he was shot and killed in the school. And when I think about it, what I remember was when I was a little girl, my dad drank a lot. He took the kids out on the porch one night while he was drunk, and he put a gun to our heads and said, I can shoot and kill you at any moment. That's what I think about. Now that's the teacher we want to talk to these kids about this. And so the issue is, and then she went on, she told me all of these other things. Her life was very complicated. And so after she went through all of that, she said this was very helpful. And then I came back for a second visit. She signed up and she said, our last session was so helpful. I felt like saying, that's not actually what I'm doing here. I'm not here for individual counseling. But the issue is these things do come to the surface. And so what you'll find is that it seems like everyone around you is falling apart because there's a lot of stuff you just don't know. And a lot of people are struggling with that. And again, they look to what is bothering them or worrying them. And so that's why in this slide, this is one of the posters they used in New York City about 6 months after 9/11. They all had the same tagline, if only the signs were this easy to read, because kids don't show you their distress a lot of the time. Because if they do, you look upset and they don't want to upset you. Or they think it's weird to feel that way. Or they know that everyone else is feeling that way, so why should you talk about it? Or why talk about it because you can't really do anything about it. There's all these reasons why people withhold their concerns, which is why we have to reach out to them. So kind of one of the last things I just wanted to go over was this timeline. And so if you look at adjustment over time, it's not a straight line. So there's ups and downs that occur. And there will be periods of distress. And a lot of times whenever we see someone in distress, we say they're in crisis. Well, actually, they're in distress. A crisis event, interestingly, is not defined by the event. A event is defined by the events and your capacity to cope with it without external support. People who are resilient may experience the same amount of distress as people in crisis. It's just they can cope with it without external support. So when you see distress in someone or feel distress, do not assume you or they are in crisis. And if you think they're resilient and can cope, do not withhold support, because they're still in distress. But let's say a crisis event does occur and it exceeds the person's capacity to cope, and then by point D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. And at this point, usually if it's a publicly known crisis, it's harder with individual or family crisis, but if it's known, people rally. They come together, they talk with each other, they come out at night and meet other people in their community that they wouldn't on a school night necessarily. They start to share food. They offer help and assistance. I grew up on Long Island. Probably shouldn't say this because it's being streamed. And I love New York City. Okay? One of my daughters lives in New York City, and I go in there in a couple of weeks again, and I love it. But, I consider myself a New Yorker, and after 9/11, it was different. People would come up and talk to you, and they were talking to you logically. They weren't just talking to their phone or voices, and they would ask you how you were doing, and it was creepy. These are people who do not share personal information, and pictures of loved ones that are missing are on every pole. It just felt very different. I had a cab driver look at me, turned around, which they never do, and he just looked at me and he said, "Do you have duct tape?" And I'm thinking, the engine's fallen out of the car and he wants duct tape. God bless New York City. And he looks at me and I said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't have any to give you." And he said, "Okay, as soon as I drop you off at your hotel, you go out and you get some duct tape and you seal your windows and your doors. And if they release anthrax, you won't get impacted by it." And I'm sitting here thinking, I was on the anthrax working group. It's like bad advice, okay? Besides, why would I ever go to New York and seal myself in a hotel room? Like why would I even go? So it was bad advice. There's no question about that. But what hit me was, that is the first, and quite honestly, the last time, a cab driver in Manhattan has actually been concerned about me as a human being and turned around and spoken to me and given advice to personally help me. It was scary. I'm like, you don't do that in New York. You turn around and you talk on your phone. But the issue is, it is a different experience. And what I would tell you is, find out what it is about this altered experience that you like and commit to continue it, because it will go away otherwise. If you are coming together as a community because you have parent meetings at night to learn things about how to help your kids, why wouldn't you do that all the time? Well, not every night, I understand. But why don't you agree to do that 4 times a year if that's what you really want and really helps you? So think about what it is, otherwise it will go away. So what happens is people start to do better, and there's an assumption sometimes like, look, the kids are better, they love routine, let's just go back to school as usual and stop talking about this. Let's start, as I often hear, let's start with a clean slate. And I go, yeah, but that doesn't work with children, because then you'd have to erase their entire memory, and you don't do that. So these are life-changing experiences. You're not going to forget them. You're not going to go back to the way you were. You've got to deal with them. But if you just withdraw the support, for some individuals, they won't go back to their baseline, and they just have continued impairment. And we owe it to kids and the adults and ourselves to continue the support until we at least get back to baseline. And for some individuals, they may actually exceed their baseline if they have enough resiliency and support. And what you will see is, for some individuals, they may actually get what we call post-traumatic growth. They may actually emerge with new insights, new empathy, new skills to more resiliency, more able to deal with adversity. So when I'm in these communities, I tell them that, yes, your children are changed, but they're not necessarily damaged. Right now they're hurting, but if they overcome that, they will become more resilient. And I'm going to be quite honest with you, I was a pediatric department chair. If I was going to hire a physician, and they didn't know a fact, I can teach them that. Or I can get someone else to teach it to them, or I can tell them to just learn it themselves. If they're not resilient, if they can't cope with distress, if they're not empathic, I don't want them working for me, because it's hard to teach. So the issue is your kid's curriculum just changed, not because anybody wanted it, but it's moved away from some academics to also now include life skills, really, really important life skills. And what I tell you is make sure they learn that curriculum well, because that's the lesson plan now. And I wish it didn't happen. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, because almost anybody would trade the post-traumatic growth for not having had the loss or crisis. But you don't have that choice. So the only thing you have to choose now is whether you're going to help them learn how to deal with what happened. And it's horrible that they have to do that, but it would be worse if they didn't cope with it. So what I will just end with is some resources. We have the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. It's at schoolcrisiscenter.org. And we also have the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, which provides a lot of information on how to support grieving kids. It has over 20 video-based modules, and it's all free of charge. It's intended for school professionals, but can also be used by adults. There's one on suicide, there's one on funeral attendance, one on guilt. So you can go and look at those, but the school professionals can. And then we also have free written material, such as this document, After a Loved One Dies, that you can download copies in English and Spanish, Chinese and Japanese as well. And you can order free copies in English or Spanish. We're supported by the New York Life Foundation, and they even pay for the shipping and handling. So it's all free, but you can just download it in a PDF and photocopy it, and it can be freely distributed. And I just put some of the contact information for our center. So I'm going to stop now and see what questions you have, and for whoever is taping, streaming, whatever, if they can stop that at this point.